In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the concept of peace is a fiction, a lie told to the trillions of souls who toil and die in service to the golden throne. What passes for peace is merely order, and that order is a brittle, fragile thing, a thin crust of enforced discipline over a boiling magma of desperation and misery. Nowhere is this truer than on a hive world. Hive, Primus. The capital hive of the planet Vesperia was a perfect example of this fragile order. It was a mountain of metal and humanity, a single continent-spanning city that clawed its way from the polluted depths of the planet's crust to pierce the toxic clouds of its upper atmosphere. Its society was a perfect brutalist pyramid. At its apex were the spire's elegant needle-thin towers of glass and marble that rose above the smog where the noble houses lived lives of unimaginable decadent luxury. Below them lay the vast gray expanse of the mid-hive, a crowded, functional world of hab-blocks manufactorums and the endless grinding machinery of the Imperium. And at its base, plunged in eternal darkness and choked by the recycled waste of the levels above, was the underhive, a crushing anarchic labyrinth where billions were born, toiled, and died without ever seeing the sky. This was the peace of Vesperia, a system of brutal grinding oppression held together by the iron fist of the enforcers and the blind, desperate faith of the masses. The apocalypse, when it came, would not be an invasion from the stars. It would be a simple cracking of this fragile, rotten foundation. The cracks were already showing, and through them the cold reality of their existence was beginning to seep. In the gray, rain-slicked corridors of the mid-hive, Kale, an enforcer of the Vesperian Palatine Guard, felt these cracks every day. He was a man of order, his faith placed in the Lex Imperialis and the satisfying definitive hum of his power maul. But he was growing weary. His days were spent not fighting criminals, but beating back starving crowds of factory workers whose rations had been cut again. He looked into their hollow, desperate eyes and saw not sedition, but a mirror of his own exhaustion. He was a jailer in a prison so vast that he too was a prisoner within its walls, and he was beginning to question the justice of the order he was sworn to uphold. Far below him, in the clanking, hellish darkness of a munitions factory in the underhive, a young woman named Ilara felt the cracks as a physical vibration of dissent. She worked a 16-hour shift, her body aching, her lungs filled with toxic fumes, her only reward a meager portion of nutrient paste. But she heard the whispers. In the brief moments of rest in the crowded hab blocks, she saw her friends and neighbors being drawn to secret gatherings, their faces filled with a dangerous, unfamiliar new emotion, hope. They spoke of a new way, a coming change, a promise of a world where they would not be the forgotten dregs at the bottom of the hive. And at the very top of it all, in a penthouse apartment of breathtaking luxury in the highest spire, Lord Marius of House Amanti was utterly oblivious to the tremors in his foundation. The world below him was an abstraction, a distant, noisy machine that produced his wealth and comfort. The occasional riot, the news of which was delivered to him on a perfumed data slate by a servitor, was a mere annoyance, a temporary disruption to the supply of exotic wines or off-world delicacies. He looked out from his crystal-clear window down at the distant gray blanket of the mid-hive and saw not a world of suffering, but a testament to the glory and order of his family's rule. The billions of souls toiling and dying beneath his feet were not real to him. They were a resource, a number in a ledger. He could not comprehend that the very foundations of his gilded cage were being eaten away by the desperation he so carelessly ignored. The agent of this decay was not a Xenos fleet or a traitor legion. It was a promise, a whisper of hope in the dark. A cult dedicated to the chaos god Tzeentch, the great changer of ways, was spreading through the desperate masses of Hive Primus like a virus. Its missionaries were not wild-eyed, blood-soaked fanatics. They were charismatic union organizers, compassionate food distributors, and secret teachers who offered the gift of knowledge to a population kept deliberately ignorant. They did not speak of demons or dark gods. They spoke of a great change. They spoke of a future where the workers would own the fruits of their labor, where the nobles would be brought low, and where the secrets of the universe would be made available to all. To a people with nothing, they offered everything: equality, power, knowledge, and hope. It was a beautiful, seductive, and utterly damnable lie, a poison coated in the sweetest of honey. And the hive, in its desperation, was beginning to drink it down. The air in the mid-hive plaza tasted of recycled water and desperation. Enforcer Kyle stood in a rigid line with his precinct squad, his heavy carapace armor feeling more like a cage than a shield. Before them, a line of 1,000 souls, their faces gaunt, and their clothes the color of factory grime, snaked around the plaza, waiting for their weekly nutrient paste ration. It was a scene Kale had witnessed 1,000 times, a ritual of controlled misery that passed for order in Hive Primus. The trouble started as it always did when the food ran out. A cry of despair went up from the back of the line, a sound that quickly curdled into a roar of collective anger. The crowd, no longer a line, but a desperate, surging mob, pushed against the barricades. Kale's sergeant gave the command, his voice a bored, metallic bark over the vox. Subdue them. Order must be maintained. Kale felt the familiar sick knot tighten in his stomach. He drew his power maul, its activation stud humming under his thumb. With a crackle of blue energy, the weapon came to life. He and his squad advanced into the crowd, a wall of black armor and crackling power fields against a tide of unarmed, starving flesh. The work was brutal and ugly. Kyle's maul, on its lowest setting, delivered a blow that sent a man spasming to the ground, his body convulsing from the neural shock. He pushed a desperate woman back with his armored boot. He was not fighting warriors. He was beating down the very people he had taken an oath to protect, all for the crime of being hungry. He saw the hatred in their eyes, a burning, impotent fury that promised a future reckoning. As they finally broke the crowd, leaving a scattering of groaning, wounded bodies on the grimy ferrocrete, Kale felt no pride in his victory. He felt only a profound and corrosive futility. He was just a hammer mindlessly beating down the nails that the system itself had caused to stick up day after day after day. Far below, in the crushing eternal darkness of the underhive, Ilara's world was a symphony of industrial hell. For 16 hours she stood at her station in Munitorum Factory 9 Delta, the air thick with the metallic tang of promethium, and the deafening rhythmic crash of 1,000 hydraulic presses stamping out artillery shell casings. The heat from the forges was a physical weight, and the noise was so absolute that the workers communicated only in a crude sign language. It was a dangerous, dehumanizing existence. She saw a man further down the line, his attention wavering for a fraction of a second from exhaustion, get his arm caught in a press. His scream was lost in the din of the machinery. The line did not stop. A servitor simply dragged his body away, and a new worker was slotted into his place from the ever-present queue of the desperate. When the shift change siren finally wailed, Ilara joined the silent, shuffling exodus of workers. Her body a single deep ache, her mind numb with fatigue. She returned to her hab unit, a coffin-sized, dripping metal box in a block that housed 10,000 other such souls. The walls were paper-thin, offering no barrier against the sounds and smells of her neighbors. As she lay on her narrow cot, trying to force down her tasteless nutrient paste, a new sound filtered through the wall. It was a voice, a calm, charismatic whisper from a neighbor's illicit voxcaster, tuned to a pirate frequency. And the masters in the spires tell you this is order. The voice set its tone, reasonable, seductive. They tell you your toil is a holy duty. But I ask you, what has your duty earned you an early grave? What has their order brought you chains? The great change is coming. A new dawn is on the horizon, a dawn of knowledge of power of a world where the last shall be first. You do not have to be the foundation for their palaces. You can be the tide that washes them all away. Ilara closed her eyes, exhausted. The words were heresy. The words were treason. But in the tired, broken darkness of her soul, they had planted a single dangerous seed of hope. The seductive whisper from the other side of the wall haunted Ilara for days. It was a dangerous hope, a heresy that could mean a summary execution. But it was also the only glimmer of light in her oppressive 16-hour darkness. Driven by a desperation that finally outweighed her fear, she sought out the source. A quiet word to a trusted co-worker, a shared knowing glance, and she was given a time and a location. That night she navigated the labyrinthine, unlit corridors of the Underhive, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The meeting was held in a vast, abandoned cistern, the air thick with the smell of stagnant water and the nervous energy of the 100 or so souls who had gathered. They were factory workers, sump scavengers, hive dregs, the forgotten and the broken, all their faces illuminated by a single flickering lumen globe, all their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a desperate, hungry hope. A man stepped into the center of the circle. He was not a wild-eyed fanatic. He was a former factorum foreman named Gregor, a man with a calm, reasonable voice and eyes that held a sharp, intelligent light. He did not speak of demons or dark gods. He spoke their language. He spoke of pain, of toil, of injustice. For generations we have been told our suffering is a holy duty. Gregor began, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. We are told to bow our heads, to work our fingers to the bone, to give our lives for an emperor we have never seen, and a system that gives us nothing but scraps from its table. He pointed upwards, a gesture towards the distant, unattainable spires. The nobles live in palaces of light while we live in this darkness. They feast while we starve. They possess all the knowledge, all the technology, all the power, and they use it only to keep us in our chains. Is this the divine order they speak of? Or is it a lie? A murmur of angry agreement swept through the crowd. Gregor smiled, a knowing, charismatic expression. He pointed to a complex star-like symbol that had been painted on the cistern wall, a symbol of a convoluted, ever-changing flame. They tell you to fear change. They tell you to fear new ideas. But I tell you that change is the only thing that can save us. This is the star of hope, the key to unlocking the potential that lies dormant within each of you. We are not heretics. We are revolutionaries. We believe in a future where the hive serves the people, not the other way around. A future of knowledge, of equality, of a great change that will wash away this rotten, stagnant order and build something new, something better in its place. Ilara listened, her skeptical heart warring with the simple, powerful truth of his words. He was not speaking of heresy. He was speaking of justice. It was a beautiful, intoxicating, and utterly reasonable promise. Miles above, in the gray, rain-slicked corridors of the mid-hive enforcer, Kale was noticing the same symbol. It was appearing everywhere, a splash of stark blue paint on the grimy plasteel walls. It was in the transit hubs on the walls outside the ration dispensaries near the Vox grills that broadcast the daily sermons from the ecclesiarchy. It was not the crude, chaotic graffiti of a common ganger cult. The symbols were placed with a deliberate, intelligent pattern. They were a message. Kale's trained, cynical eye saw a network, a coordinated effort. He logged the occurrences, compiled a report, and brought it to his precinct captain, a jaded, heavy-set man named Vorlag, whose desk was piled high with reports of riots and violent crime. Strange symbols. Kale Vorlag grunted, not even looking up from his data slate. You want me to dedicate manpower to chasing down graffiti artists? Kale stood his ground. Sir, it's organized. The placement is too specific. It's appearing in high-traffic areas, places of discontent. I think it's the mark of a new political movement. Something seditious. Vorlag finally looked up, his eyes weary and annoyed. Everything in this hive is seditious, Kale. The whole damn place is a powder keg. My problem is keeping the lid on, not worrying about who's painting on the walls. We have 3 active riots in the Hab sectors, a turf war between 2 major gangs, and I have the Adeptus Arbits breathing down my neck about arrest quotas. I don't have time for this. It's just noise. Focus on your beat. Disperse the crowds. Maintain the order. That's your job. Kale saluted, his jaw tight with frustration. Yes, sir. He walked out of the precinct, the captain's dismissive words echoing in his ears. The system was so preoccupied with suppressing the symptoms of its own sickness, the riots, the crime, the desperation, that it was completely willfully blind to the new, more intelligent disease that was beginning to fester in its very heart. The whispers of the great change did not remain whispers for long. The cult, having planted its seeds in the fertile ground of desperation, now began to actively cultivate chaos. The shift from subversive ideology to open violence was not a sudden explosion, but a series of precise, calculated strikes designed to bleed the hive's system of order, drop by agonizing drop. The first sign came not as a riot, but as a silent professional execution. Enforcer Kale was called to the Hab block of a mid-level administratum official, a man named Prefect Orlin, whose job was to oversee the logistical distribution of nutrient rations to the underhive. The crime scene was unnervingly clean. There was no sign of a forced entry. The prefect sat at his desk, a data slate still clutched in his hand. A single perfectly circular hole burned through his temple. The wound was cauterized, the work of a high-powered las pistol fired at close range by a steady hand. Kale, who was accustomed to the brutal, messy carnage of ganger warfare, felt a chill run down his spine. This was not the work of a common criminal. This was the work of a trained assassin. It was a political statement, a declaration that the agents of the system were no longer safe. The second strike was aimed not at a person, but at the very sustenance of the hive. A week later, a catastrophic malfunction occurred at Agro Silo 9, one of the primary storage facilities for the nutrient paste that fed the millions in the lower levels. An investigation revealed it was no accident. The primary reclamation and purification systems had been deliberately sabotaged, contaminating millions of tons of food. The effect was immediate and devastating. The already meager rations were cut in half. The desperation that had been simmering in the underhive now boiled over into open panic and widespread, violent rioting. Ilara watched from the relative safety of her Hab block as the corridors of her world became a war zone, mobs of starving, desperate people fighting each other, and the enforcers for scraps of spoiled food. The hope that Gregor's words had kindled in her was now tainted with fear. Was this the great change he had promised? A future built on the starvation of her own people? Miles above this chaos, in the serene, climate-controlled luxury of his spire-top palace, Lord Marius Amanti was inconvenienced. He was in the middle of a recital, a renowned virtuoso playing a lament on a priceless ancient stringed instrument, when his major domo servitor approached its movements, a silent, apologetic glide. "My lord," the servitor's synthesized voice whispered, "I regret to inform you that the shipment of Amasek from the orbital docks has been delayed. The lower sectors are experiencing logistical difficulties." Marius let out an audible sigh of exasperation, loud enough for his guests to hear. Again he said, his tone one of profound, petulant annoyance. "This is becoming a dreadful bore. What is the point of paying tithes to the Palatine Guard if they cannot even keep the transit ways clear? Make an inquiry. I want my shipment by nightfall." For him, the roaring, starving, dying city below was not a human tragedy. It was a supply chain issue, an irritating background noise that was interfering with his refined pleasures. The lives being lost were as abstract and as meaningless to him as the dust motes dancing in the sunbeam that streamed through his crystal window. Back in the smoke-choked corridors of the mid-hive, Kyle stood over the body of another rioter he had been forced to strike down. His power maul felt impossibly heavy in his hand. The air was thick with the smell of burning promethium and blood. As his squad began to restore their brutal form of order, his eyes were drawn to a freshly painted symbol on the wall behind the barricades, a symbol that had been hidden until the crowd had been cleared. It was the now familiar convoluted blue star of the cult. And in that moment, the pieces clicked together in his weary mind with a sickening, terrible clarity. The strange graffiti, the professional assassination of a logistics official, the calculated sabotage of the food supply, and the resulting predictable explosion of chaos. This was not a series of unfortunate events. This was a plan. An intelligent patient and utterly ruthless enemy was not just attacking the hive. It was systematically and deliberately turning the hive against itself, using the desperation of the masses as its primary weapon. Kyle looked from the symbol to the resentful, hateful faces of the people he was supposed to be protecting. He was not a guardian of order. He was a pawn in a game he was only just beginning to understand, and his city was the board upon which this terrible, silent war was being waged. The moment of the great change. The moment the cultists called the hour of ascension did not arrive with a grand declaration or a formal challenge. It arrived with the tolling of a bell. For millennia, the great chime of Hive Primus had marked the beginning of the primary work shift, its deep, resonant toll, a signal for millions of souls to begin their daily grind. But for the followers of Tzeentch, this specific chime on this specific day was the preordained signal, a cosmic alarm clock set for the death of the old world. As the final echoing note of the chime faded into the perpetual hum of the hive, the city held its breath for a single silent second. And then it exploded. All across the vast vertical landscape of Hive Primus, the uprising was a single, perfectly synchronized act of revolutionary violence. In the hellish depths of Munitorum Factory 9 Delta, Ilara's co-workers did not move to their stations. Instead, they reached into hidden compartments in the machinery, pulling out sharpened tools, crude stub guns, and stolen auto pistols. Their overseer, a brutal man with a shock maul, opened his mouth to scream a threat, but he was silenced by a dozen simultaneous shots, his body torn apart. The great factory, a symbol of their oppression, became the first fortress of the rebellion. In the gray, crowded corridors of the mid-hive, the attack was just as swift. Seemingly ordinary citizens, vendors, and pilgrims suddenly produced weapons from hidden caches beneath their carts and robes. Enforcer patrols were ambushed in coordinated crossfires, their carapace armor, no defense against 100 simultaneous attacks. Power conduits were severed with demolition charges, plunging entire sectors into darkness and chaos. The revolution, whispered for months in the dark, had finally roared into the light. For Enforcer Kale, the world ended in the middle of a cup of stale recaf. He was in his precinct's ready room, the air thick with the smell of ozone and bitter stimulants, when the alarms blared. It was not the familiar siren of a riot, but the high-pitched, frantic scream of a full-scale assault. He grabbed his power maul and helmet and ran to the main gate just as it was hit by a massive improvised battering ram. The great steel doors buckled inwards, and through the breach poured a tide of humanity, their faces no longer desperate but masks of ecstatic, fanatical fury. They were armed with autoguns, las pistols, and crude, heavy-duty industrial tools. Kale and his squad formed a desperate shield wall, the blue crackle of their power mauls a thin, fragile line against the roaring horde. He was no longer a policeman dispersing a crowd. He was a soldier on a fortress wall, besieged by an army that had materialized from the very people he had sworn to protect. Caught in the firestorm between the underhive and the midhive, Ilara was swept up in the chaos. The transit station she was in became a battlefield. She saw her neighbors, their eyes blazing with a strange new light as they charged a small, pinned-down squad of enforcers. She saw Gregor, the charismatic foreman who had spoken of a better future, now leading a charge, a stolen enforcer shotgun in his hands. He saw her, his face alight with revolutionary zeal. "Ilara, join us. The hour of ascension is here. The great change is now." On the other side of the barricade, a young, terrified enforcer, his helmet gone, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, screamed at her. "Help us in the Emperor's name. They're traitors." She was frozen, trapped in the crossfire between the brutal, oppressive order she had always known, and the violent, terrifying, and seductive promise of its destruction. Miles above it all, Lord Marius Amanti frowned. The delicate imported wine in his crystal glass was trembling, a result of some distant, low-frequency explosion that had vibrated through the very structure of the spire. The lights in his penthouse flickered, and the soft, classical music from his vox emitter dissolved into static. Annoyed, he strode onto his vast, open-air balcony to survey the source of the disturbance. He expected to see the telltale smoke of a minor hab-block fire or a small riot. Instead, he looked down upon a sight of such apocalyptic scale that his mind struggled to process it. The entire hive, from the gray blanket of the mid-hive to the dark abyss of the underhive, was on fire. 100 columns of black smoke clawed their way into the polluted sky. The distant, constant hum of the city had been replaced by a new sound, a rolling, thunderous roar of gunfire and explosions. The city below was not rioting. It was a single, vast, and burning battlefield. His gilded cage, his palace in the sky, was now a lonely island, in an ocean of fire. And for the first time in his life, Lord Marius felt the cold, unfamiliar touch of genuine fear. The hour of ascension was not an hour. It was an eternity of fire and blood that marked the death of the old Vesperia. For Enforcer Kale, trapped inside the besieged Precinct 9 Delta, the world had shrunk to the confines of a barricaded doorway and the desperate, ragged breathing of his fellow officers. The hive-wide uprising had been brutally effective. Their precinct, once a symbol of the unyielding authority of the Lex Imperialis, was now a tiny, isolated island of order in an ocean of homicidal chaos. The mob outside was a faceless, roaring horde, their makeshift weapons a chaotic storm of metal and fire against the precinct's walls. The laws, Kale had sworn to uphold rules of engagement, the sanctity of civilian life. The proper application of force had become a meaningless joke in the space of a few minutes. There was only one law now survived. The fighting was a brutal, close-quarters nightmare. The cultists, their faces painted with the blue star-like symbol of their faith, charged with a suicidal, fanatical glee that Kale had never witnessed before. They threw themselves at the barricades, their bodies piling up, their only purpose to create a ramp of their own dead for the next wave to climb. Kale's power maul, once a tool for crowd control, was now a weapon of desperate life-or-death butchery. He swung it not to subdue, but to shatter bone and pulp flesh, his arm, aching, his armor dented and scorched. His mind, once a place of cynical weariness, was now a cold, clear engine of survival. The distinction between a rioter and an enemy soldier, between a citizen and a target, had been erased. They were the enemy. His job was to kill them. After hours of relentless fighting, a section of the precinct wall was breached by a demolition charge. The horde poured in. The enforcers were forced to abandon their fortified positions and fall back room by bloody room. Kyle's captain was torn apart by a cultist wielding a heavy industrial shear. Kyle saw it happen, but he felt nothing. There was no time for grief or rage, only for a tactical assessment. Command structure was broken. He, as one of the most senior surviving officers, was now in charge of the handful of enforcers left. "Fall back," he roared, his voice a raw, unfamiliar bark. "To the upper-level sky bridge. We're breaking out." They fought their way to the Sky Bridge, a narrow exposed walkway that connected their precinct to a neighboring hab block. It was their only escape route. But as they reached it, they saw a new horror. A fresh wave of armed cultists was advancing on the bridge from the other side, and in front of them, pushed forward as a screaming, terrified human shield, was a mob of unarmed civilians' families who had been caught in the crossfire. Kale and his 5 remaining enforcers took cover, their lace guns raised. The cultists were using the civilians to cover their advance, knowing that an Imperial enforcer's first duty was to protect the innocent. A young officer next to Kale looked at him, his eyes wide with panic. "Sir, what do we do?" "We can't fire on them." Kale looked at the scene. The screaming civilians, the advancing armed cultists. He saw the tactical reality. If the cultists took the bridge, his squad would be trapped and annihilated. His old self, the weary but duty-bound policeman, wrestled with his new self, the desperate, brutal soldier. He remembered his captain's final defiant order to another squad, just before he was killed. Hold the line, no matter the cost. The cost. He looked at the faces in the crowd, the innocent, terrified faces of the people he had sworn to protect. He thought of the hungry faces in the ration lines, the faces he used to beat back with his maul. A cold, terrible clarity descended upon him. In this new world, there were no innocents. There was only the line and the enemy. They are shielding the enemy. Kyle said, his voice, a dead, cold monotone that he barely recognized as his own. They are an obstacle to our survival. The line must be held. He raised his laser gun, aimed not at the cultists, but at the center mass of the crowd. "Fire," he commanded. The young officer stared at him in horror for a second, then, his own survival instinct overriding his conscience, he too raised his weapon. The disciplined, high-powered beams of their laser guns cut into the crowd. The human shields, their screams cut short, fell in a bloody heap. For a moment, the cultists' advance faltered, shocked by the enforcers' brutality. It was the opening Kale needed. "Advance and purge," he roared and charged across the bridge, his power maul, swinging his humanity, a casualty left behind, amidst the bodies of the very people he had just slaughtered to survive. The transit station had become a slaughterhouse. Ilara, frozen in the crossfire, saw the truth of the great change in an instant. She saw the ecstatic, murderous rage in the eyes of her former co-workers as they tore apart the cornered enforcers, and she saw the cold, indiscriminate brutality of the enforcers as they fired back into the crowd. Gregor, the man who had spoken of hope and justice, now had the eyes of a fanatic, screaming for more blood. This was not a revolution. It was a descent into madness. There was no side to choose. There was only survival. In the chaotic confusion, she grabbed the only family she had left, her 2 young siblings, huddled and terrified behind a rusted bulkhead, and fled not up into the mid-hive, but down deeper into the dark, forgotten bowels of the underhive. Her world, once a predictable cycle of grueling work and exhausted rest, was now a constant, desperate flight through a landscape of urban hell. She was not alone. She gathered a small, pathetic band of fellow survivors, her brother Mika and sister Lena, an old, one-eyed sump prospector named Corvin who knew the secret tunnels and forgotten waterways, and a handful of workers from her factory whose families had been killed in the initial uprising. They were a flock of sheep in a world of wolves, and Ilara, through no choice of her own, became their shepherd. Their old currency of imperial thrones was now worthless. The new currencies were clean water, untainted food, and ammunition. Every day was a desperate search for these treasures. The Underhive had always been a dangerous place, ruled by its own brutal laws of gang warfare. Now, with the enforcers gone, it was a kingdom of unchecked savagery. The old gangs, like the corpse grinders and the sump scabs, had become warlords, seizing control of vital resources. To get a single bucket of semi-potable water, Ilara's group had to navigate the territory of a ganger king, who demanded a tithe of either weapons or people. They watched in horror as a family was forced to give up their teenage son as payment, the boy dragged away into the darkness to an unknown fate. They learned to move like ghosts, to travel through the suffocating slime-coated maintenance shafts, to eat the strange phosphorescent fungi that grew in the dark, and to never ever trust anyone. Their journey forced them to pass through one of the sectors that had been liberated by the cult of the Great Change. The blue, eight-pointed star of Tzeentch was painted everywhere, a symbol of their new, terrible authority. Here, the chaos was different. It was an organized madness. The cultists, their eyes blazing with a fanatical light, were distributing stolen food, but not out of charity. It was a tool of conversion. To receive a ration, one had to renounce the emperor and pledge allegiance to the Great Change. The architect of fate has freed us a new preacher, a woman with unnaturally bright, multicolored eyes, proclaimed to a hungry crowd, "Cast off the shackles of the old ways, embrace the flux, embrace your own potential." Ilara and her group were forced to play along, to bow their heads and chant the blasphemous litanies, the words like ash in their mouths, just to receive a stale block of nutrient paste. They saw people they had known their whole lives now speaking in strange riddles, their bodies beginning to twitch with unseen energies. This was not liberation. It was a different, more insidious form of slavery. After weeks of this harrowing journey, the old prospector Corvin led them to what he promised was a safe haven, a sealed, decommissioned power substation forgotten by the hive for centuries. They managed to pry open a rusted maintenance hatch and slip inside. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they were in a place of relative silence and security. The air was stale but breathable. It was defensible. They had a small supply of scavenged food and water. For a single fleeting moment, they allowed themselves to feel a glimmer of hope. They had survived. As her siblings finally cried themselves to sleep, Ilara leaned against a cold metal wall, the exhaustion of her ordeal washing over her. But as the silence deepened, she began to hear a new sound. It was not the distant sound of gunfire. It was a low, rhythmic, and deeply unsettling chanting seeming to come from the very walls around them. And from a crack in the floor, a faint, unnatural, and pulsating blue light began to leak through. Corvin's face went pale. "By the throne," he whispered. "This ain't a substation. We're in the walls of one of their temples." They had not found a sanctuary. They had stumbled directly into the nest of the serpent. For the first week of the uprising, life for Lord Marius Amanti and the other nobles in the spires was an exercise in frustrated denial. The sea of fire that had consumed the lower hive was a terrifying but distant spectacle, a grand, chaotic painting to be observed from the safety of their armored balconies. Their primary concerns were not survival, but inconvenience. The supply elevators from the mid-hive had ceased their endless journey, cutting off the flow of off-world delicacies, fine amasec, and luxury goods. The automated food synthesizers in their lavish apartments, their raw material stores now empty, fell silent. The power, once as reliable and unnoticed as the air they breathed, now flickered intermittently. The nobles complained. They sent angry Vox messages to the Lord Governor, messages that went unanswered. They gathered for emergency councils in their gilded halls. Their discussions focused not on the unfolding civil war, but on how to restore their comforts. They were gods in a heaven whose foundations had crumbled, and they had not yet realized they were in free fall. The realization came with the first unfamiliar pangs of true hunger. For Marius, a man whose entire life had been a curated experience of the finest sensory pleasures, the sensation was a profound and humbling violation. The gnawing emptiness in his stomach was a base animal feeling he was completely unequipped to comprehend. The lavish feasts, the multi-course meals, the cellars of priceless wine, all were now a torturous memory. His family's diet was reduced to a single, carefully rationed nutrient bar per day, a tasteless gray block that was the standard fare for the very people whose suffering he had never considered. The pristine filtered water from their taps began to taste stale. The silence, once a treasured luxury, was now an oppressive, unnerving thing, broken only by the distant, unending thunder of the war below. But the true collapse came not from without, but from within. The social order of the spire, a structure as rigid and as ancient as the hive itself, disintegrated in the face of scarcity. The currency of thrones and noble bloodlines became worthless overnight. A new currency emerged, one based on the simple, brutal realities of their new existence: food, water, and the weapons to protect them. And it was their own guards, the disciplined, gene-bulked house troopers they had employed for generations, who now held all the wealth. The shift in power was as swift as it was absolute. Marius's own captain of the guard, a man named Vorlag, who had served his father with unquestioning loyalty, now stood with his men before the family's locked food pantry, his hand resting on the grip of his bolt pistol. When Marius gave him a direct order to distribute the rations, Vorlag did not salute. He laughed, a short, ugly, and utterly insubordinate sound. "Your thrones are just worthless metal now, my lord." The guard said, his voice no longer respectful, but filled with a cold, predatory confidence. "The food in that pantry is worth more than your entire family name." New rules. Marius was now a prisoner in his own home, his family's survival subject to the whims of the very men he had once commanded. He was forced to barter priceless works of art, heirlooms that had been in his family for centuries, for a single dented can of water. He saw his neighbors, other great lords and ladies, reduced to squabbling, pathetic animals, their noble decorum stripped away by the raw, humbling power of starvation. The breaking point came when one of Vorlag's men, emboldened by the new order, tried to force his way into Marius's sister's chambers. In that moment, a primal protective instinct that Marius never knew he possessed erupted through his pampered, decadent facade. He was not a warrior. He had never held a weapon in his life. But as the guard shoved his sister aside, Marius grabbed the heaviest object he could find, a solid gold antique statue of an imperial saint, and brought it down, with all his might, on the back of the guard's head. The fight was a clumsy, pathetic, and desperate brawl. Marius was no match for the gene-bulked trooper, but he fought with the frantic, terrified fury of a cornered animal. He was thrown across the room, his fine clothes tearing his body, screaming in protest. But as the guard advanced on him, his face a mask of contempt, Marius saw a ceremonial power sword that had hung on the wall as a decoration for 1,000 years. He scrambled for it, his fingers fumbling with the activation stud. The blade hissed to life, its blue energy field casting a ghastly light on the scene. The guard, laughing at the nobleman trying to play soldier, charged. Marius, acting on pure panicked instinct, simply thrust the blade forward. The guard, in his arrogance, impaled himself upon it, his laughter turning into a wet, gurgling gasp. Marius stood there, his hands trembling violently, the heavy sword humming in his grip, as the body of his former servant slid to the floor. He stared at his own hands, now spattered with the blood of the man he had just killed. The sheltered, useless aristocrat was dead, and in his place was something new, something harder, something that had learned the first brutal lesson of the new world to survive. He would have to become as much of a savage as the ones he had once looked down upon. While the spire dwellers fought their private wars of desperation, the official military response of the planet was grinding to a bloody, futile halt. The Vesperian Planetary Defense Force. The PDF was an army trained for a war it would never fight. For centuries, its soldiers had drilled for glorious open-field battles against hypothetical Xenos invaders, their days spent in parades and maneuvers. Their only real combat experience was in suppressing the poorly armed and disorganized riots of the lower hives, an experience that had taught them nothing but arrogance. Now they were faced with a true, full-scale insurgency. A war fought not on an open plain, but in the tight, multi-layered and treacherous confines of the hive they had sworn to protect. The PDF commanders, relying on the dusty tactical manuals of the Tactica Imperialis, responded with a conventional and therefore suicidal strategy. Armored columns of Lehman Russ battle tanks and Chimera transports thundered down the great transit ways of the mid-hive, their objective to seize and hold key strategic junctions. But the hive was not a battlefield of neat lines and clear objectives. It was a three-dimensional labyrinth, and the cultists were its masters. The armored columns were death traps. From the levels above, the cultists who had spent their lives working in these very structures rained down a storm of improvised explosives and stolen heavy weapons. A Lehman Russ, its cannon useless against an enemy, 1,000 feet directly above it, would be crippled by a demolition charge dropped from a ventilation shaft. A squad of guardsmen disembarking from a chimera would be cut down by a crossfire from 100 different hidden windows and maintenance tunnels. The cultists were ghosts. They were the factory workers who had built these corridors, the sanitation crews who knew the sewer systems, the hab dwellers who knew every secret passage and bolt hole. They would strike with brutal efficiency and then vanish back into the very walls of the hive, sheltered and hidden by a populace that now saw them as liberators. For the common PDF soldier, it was a psychological nightmare. They were fighting in a city where every civilian was a potential enemy, every doorway a potential ambush. Their morale, already strained, began to crumble under the weight of a war they could not understand, against an enemy they could not find. The final fatal blow to the PDF's war effort was not dealt by a weapon, but by a whisper. The cult's pirate vox broadcasts were a constant seductive poison, an omnipresent voice that spoke not to the commanders, but to the common soldier. Brothers, sisters of the PDF. The charismatic voice of Gregor would say, his tone one of reasonable camaraderie. Who are you fighting for? For the faceless, decadent lords in the spires who have never known a day of hardship? Or are you fighting against your own people? Against your brothers, your sisters, your parents, who ask only for a fair share of the wealth they create? The great change is for you too. Lay down your laser gun and join us. There is a place for you in the new world we are building. For a soldier who was tired, scared, and fighting for a cause he no longer believed in. Against people who looked just like him. The promise was a potent one. The desertions began as a trickle, then became a flood. A squad ordered to fire on a civilian hab block that was sheltering cultists would instead turn their weapons on their own commissar. A tank crew, seeing the futility of their advance, would paint the blue star of Tzinch on their turret and join the ranks of the rebellion. Entire platoons and then entire companies simply dissolved, their soldiers melting away into the populace or openly switching sides. From the central command bastion, the PDF generals watched in horror as their tactical displays, once a clean map of green friendly forces, became a chaotic spreading plague of red. Their army was not being defeated. It was evaporating, its own soldiers won over by the simple, powerful, and heretical idea that they were fighting on the wrong side of the war. Trapped in the sealed-off power substation, Ilara and her small band of survivors became unwilling observers of the great change's horrifying consummation. For weeks, the cult-controlled sector outside had been a place of strange, feverish celebration. But now, as their grip on the territory solidified and the last pockets of enforcer resistance were purged, the atmosphere began to shift. The revolutionary speeches about equality and justice became less frequent, replaced by strange, esoteric sermons about embracing the flux and the beauty of transformation. The leaders of the cult, men and women who had once been simple foremen and workers, now carried themselves with an unnerving, otherworldly grace, their eyes burning with a light that was not entirely human. The first physical signs of the change were subtle, and the cultists hailed them as divine gifts, as blessings from the architect of fate. A woman who had been a loyal follower found that the skin on her arm had taken on a shimmering crystalline quality. A man discovered he could whisper a single complex thought directly into the mind of another from across a crowded room. These were seen as the first steps towards their promised ascension, proof that they were evolving beyond the crude limitations of their mortal flesh. But soon, the changes began to accelerate, becoming less like blessings and more like grotesque, uncontrolled mutations. The woman's crystalline skin began to spread, her arm elongating into a sharp, jagged talon of what looked like raw pink crystal. The man's telepathic whispers became an uncontrollable psychic scream that caused those around him to bleed from the ears. The true horror was unleashed when the cult's leaders, with Gregor at their head, gathered the faithful in the sector's central plaza for a great ritual to fully welcome the great change. Ilara, peering through a cracked and grimy viewport from her hiding place, watched the scene unfold. A great swirling vortex of impossible scintillating colors, pinks, blues, and purples, was summoned in the center of the plaza. It was not a fire. It was a wound in reality itself, a tear in the fabric of the material world that led to somewhere else. The cultists began to chant, no longer in low Gothic, but in a strange, clicking and bird-like language that seemed to twist the very air, its syllables a direct assault on the sanity of those who heard them. As the vortex grew in power, the transformations became explosive and absolute. A man who had been promised the strength to break his chains screamed as his arms writhed and tore themselves apart, multiplying into a dozen flailing, feather-covered limbs. A woman who had been promised a mind of crystal clarity shrieked as her skull and face dissolved, not into gore, but into a single massive multifaceted crystal eye that wept tears of pure molten warp energy. Their bodies lost all cohesion, their flesh flowing and bubbling like hot wax, their human forms collapsing into new, impossible and monstrous shapes. Their voices, once human, became a chorus of insane cackling and gibbering screams. Ilara watched in abject, soul-shattering horror as Gregor, the man whose reasonable, hopeful words had once offered her a sliver of light, strode into the heart of the vortex. His body was engulfed in the raw, mutating power. He grew taller, his form elongating his skin, turning a bright, horrifying blue. His mouth widened into a lipless maw filled with shark-like teeth, and his eyes multiplied across his face. He was no longer a man. He had become a gibbering, cackling, multi-limbed monstrosity of pure, raw magic. He had become a horror of Tzinch, a demon given flesh. The revolution was a lie. The promise of a better future was a cosmic, monstrous joke. The cult had not sought to liberate the people of the Underhive. It had sought to use their bodies, their hopes, and their souls as the raw, screaming fuel to tear a hole in reality and summon their true, mad gods. The last ember of hope in Ilara's heart was extinguished, replaced by a cold, absolute, and terrifying understanding. There were no saviors. There were no liberators. There were only monsters, and she was trapped in their cage. Weeks had passed since the hour of ascension. The hive was a charnel house, a vast vertical tomb where millions had died, and millions more were locked in a brutal, unending struggle for survival. Hope was a dead currency, a forgotten language from a world that no longer existed. The Vox channels, once the lifeblood of the city's communication, were now a cacophony of static, the insane, cackling whispers of the warp and the screams of the dying. Then a miracle occurred. A new signal, faint and heavily distorted, cut through the noise. It was on a broad emergency frequency, a signal that was being desperately broadcast across the entire planet. It was a human voice, clipped professional, and filled with the unwavering iron certainty of the Astra Militarum. ++ static ++ to any loyalist forces on Vesperia. ++ crackle ++. This is Lord Castellan Dvorak of the Cadian 88th Mechanized Infantry. The Emperor's hammer is inbound. Our landers will make planetfall in 72 standard hours. I repeat, 72 hours. Hold your positions. Purge the heretic. The guard is coming. Ave Imperator. Plus static, plus. The message looped a tiny defiant beacon of order in an ocean of absolute chaos. For Kale and his handful of surviving enforcers, the message was a draft of pure, undiluted adrenaline. They were holed up in the ruins of a mid-hive medici station, their ammunition almost gone, their bodies bruised and broken their barricades on the verge of collapsing under the weight of another fanatical assault. They were preparing for their last stand, a final futile act of defiance. Then the message crackled through their squad vox bead. The Cadian 88th, the Kasserkin. They were not just being sent aid, they were being sent the best of the best legendary heroes of the Cadian Gate. Kale looked at the bloody, exhausted faces of his men, and for the first time in weeks of unending horror, he saw a flicker of genuine hope. A hard, grim smile cracked his chapped lips. "You heard him." Kale's voice was a rough, gravelly bark. "The guard is coming." He slammed a fresh power pack into his lasgun. "That means we have a new mission. We are no longer retreating. We are holding the line. We will hold it for 72 hours or we will die on this barricade." The message had given them more than just the promise of reinforcement. It had given them a purpose beyond mere survival. Deep in the underhive, in the sealed, terrifying silence of the abandoned power substation, the old prospector Corvin hunched over a scavenged, hand-cranked Vox set, his one good eye wide. He had caught the same faint broadcast. He relayed the message in a hushed, excited whisper to Ilara and the others. Ilara felt a strange, conflicted emotion. The Imperial Guard. They were the iron fist of the same brutal regime that had condemned her and her people to a life of misery. They were not liberators, but they were human. And they were not the gibbering, flesh-twisting, reality-bending abominations that she could hear chanting and screaming outside their hiding place. The Guard represented a return to a known, understandable form of horror, and in this new, insane world, that was a form of salvation in itself. She looked at her terrified siblings huddled in the dark. Did you hear that she whispered, her voice filled with a newfound steely resolve? Help is coming. We just have to stay alive. We just have to hold on for 3 more days. And miles above, in the cold, dark, and silent luxury of his spire-top penthouse, Lord Marius Amanti, his face thin from hunger and his hands stained with the blood of his former guards, heard the message crackle to life on a high-end Vox console that had momentarily regained power. He heard the words, Cadian 88th and Lord Castellan, and a wild feral grin spread across his face. This was a force he understood, a power that respected the ancient hierarchy of the Imperium. They were not coming to save the hive. They were coming to save him, to restore him to his rightful place, to put the rabble back in their chains. His hope was not one of survival, but of restoration. "They're coming," he whispered to his sister, his eyes blazing with a feverish aristocratic pride. "Our salvation is at hand. We have won." Across the vast, burning and dying hive, in the deepest, darkest corners of despair, a single weak message had done the impossible. It had rekindled the fire of the human spirit. The broken soldier, the terrified refugee, and the fallen nobleman, each trapped in their own private hell, were now united by a single, beautiful, treacherous, and ultimately doomed hope that someone was coming to save them. 72 hours of blood desperation and renewed fanatical hope had passed. The survivors of Hive Primus on all sides of the conflict held their breath and looked to the sky. And the sky answered. It began not with a promise of salvation, but with a brutal orbital insertion that was an act of war in itself. Dozens of blocky, brutalist Imperial Guard troop transports and frigates punched through the toxic upper atmosphere, their armored hulls glowing with the heat of re-entry. From their cavernous bays descended a storm of iron and fire, thousands of Valkyrie gunships and coffin-like drop sentinels a rain of steel that fell upon the burning city. This was not a relief force. This was an army of occupation. This was the Emperor's hammer, and it had come not to save, but to judge. The great landing zones cleared by preliminary orbital bombardment that vaporized entire sectors of the hive became the staging grounds for the Cadian 88th Mechanized Infantry. They were a vision of pure, disciplined war. They disembarked from their transports not with the weariness of a long journey, but with the cold, focused calm of professionals arriving to do a dirty job. Their flak armor was clean, their lasguns polished, their discipline absolute. They were the famed shock troops of Cadia, a regiment forged for generations in the fires of the galaxy's most brutal war zone. They had seen the face of the arch-enemy, and it had taught them a single brutal lesson. There is no such thing as an innocent bystander in a war against heresy. Their orders were simple. Their methods were efficient. Their mercy was non-existent. Kale and his 5 surviving enforcers, their bodies bruised and their ammunition spent, after holding their line for 3 days, felt a surge of triumphant relief as the first Valkyries screamed overhead. "They're here," a young officer next to him cried, his face breaking into a bloody grin. "We're saved," Kyle established a Vox link on the designated loyalist frequency. "This is Enforcer Sergeant Kale of the Vesperian Palatine Guard." He broadcast, his voice hoarse. "We have held Sector Gamma 9. We require reinforcement and resupply." The reply that came back was not one of camaraderie. It was a cold, flat, and suspicious voice. "Unidentified combatant, your designation is not on our roster. You are in a contaminated zone. Lay down your arms and prepare to be processed. Failure to comply will be met with lethal force." Kyle stared in disbelief. They were not seen as allies. They were seen as part of the contamination, another variable to be controlled and purged. For Ilara and her small band of refugees, the arrival of the Guard was a far more direct and terrifying experience. Seeing the Imperial Aquila on the sides of the descending gunships, she made a desperate choice. They would make for the Guard's landing zone, a place of order, a place of evacuation. They emerged from the shadows of the Underhive, a pathetic, ragged group of unarmed civilians, their hands held high, waving scraps of white cloth. They were met not by medics, but by a line of kneeling Cadian troopers. The officer in charge, his face a cold, emotionless mask, gave a simple command. "Potential contaminants. Sanitize the area." A single, disciplined, overwhelming volley of lasgun fire erupted from the line. The air filled with the snap hiss of hundreds of energy beams. Ilara screamed, pulling her siblings to the ground as the people around her were torn apart, their bodies bursting into flame and steam. They had run from the monsters of the cult, only to find themselves in the sights of a new, even more implacable kind of monster, one that wore a human face. She and her group scrambled back into the darkness, the disciplined fire of their supposed saviors chasing them. Miles above in his spire, Lord Marius Amanti watched the arrival with a surge of arrogant pride. He established a high-priority Vox link to the Cadian command vessel in orbit, his voice full of the unquestioned authority he had always known. "This is Lord Marius of House Amanti, hereditary ruler of this hive," he announced. "I commend you on your timely arrival. I require immediate extraction for myself and my family, and I expect a full report from your commander on his plan to restore my authority." The pause on the other end of the line was long and cold. Finally, a Cadian officer replied, his voice utterly devoid of deference. "Lord Marius, your title is noted. You are a low-priority civilian asset. Remain in your location. Do not interfere with military operations. Your status will be evaluated in due course." The channel went dead. Marius stared at the silent Vox console, his face a mask of shocked fury. He was not the priority. He was not the master. To the brutal, efficient war machine of the Imperial Guard, he was just another piece of the problem. The brutal reality had descended upon them all. The Imperial Guard had not come to save Vesperia. They had come to purge it. Their enemy was not just the cult, it was the entire hive. Every man, woman, and child was a potential heretic, a potential carrier of the chaotic taint. The hive was no longer a city to be liberated. It was a tumor to be excised from the body of the Imperium. The war had not ended. It had simply entered a new, more brutal and more hopeless phase, a three-way meat grinder between the fanatics of the cult, the merciless judgment of the Guard, and the terrified, innocent souls trapped screaming in the middle. The arrival of the Imperial Guard did not quell the chaos. It fed it. The hive, once a two-sided conflict, was now a three-way meat grinder of unimaginable brutality. The sheer, concentrated outpour of violence, hatred, and terror was a psychic beacon. The billions of deaths, the fanatical, worshipful belief of the Tsienchian cultists, the cold, merciless slaughter enacted by the Cadians, and the raw, screaming despair of the trapped civilians, all of it combined into a perfect, horrific storm of spiritual energy. For weeks, this energy had been battering against the thin, fragile veil that separates the material universe from the nightmare dimension of the warp. The cultists, in their madness, had been deliberately weakening this barrier with their blood-soaked rituals and reality-bending chants. Now, under the immense focused pressure of a planet-wide war, the veil did not just weaken. It shattered. The first signs were subtle glitches in the fabric of reality. In the cult-held sectors of the underhive, physics became a matter of opinion. Corridors would twist back on themselves in impossible non-Euclidean loops. Gravity would flicker, causing men to float for a few terrifying seconds before slamming back to the ground. Strange, impossible colors, hues for which the human eye had no name, began to bleed into the edges of vision. In orbit, the augur arrays of the Imperial Guard fleet went haywire, their screens filled with nonsensical screaming data, as their sensors registered spatial distortions and energy readings that defied all known science. The planet's magnetic field, the silent shield that had protected it for millennia, began to violently fluctuate and then collapse entirely. Then the sky broke. For centuries, the sky above Hive Primus had been a perpetual unbroken ceiling of thick, toxic yellow-gray smog, a permanent testament to the Hive's endless industry. But now this ceiling began to move. The clouds began to swirl, not in a natural weather pattern, but in a vast, counterclockwise vortex, as if a colossal, unseen hand was stirring the very atmosphere. A strange, silent, multicolored light began to glow from the heart of the vortex. The clouds were not pushed aside. They were torn, ripped apart with a violence that was felt in the very soul of every living being on the planet. For the first time in 1,000 years, the people of Vesperia saw what lay beyond their polluted sky. It was not the cold, familiar, star-dusted void of space. It was a raw, roiling, living ocean of pure chaos. A great bleeding wound had been torn in the sky, a rift that looked out into the impossible kaleidoscopic madness of the warp itself. It was a swirling cosmic storm of raw emotion and pure, untamed magic, its colors shifting from ecstatic pinks to despairing blues to furious reds. It was a silent, screaming testament to the victory of the cult, a gateway to the realm of their mad god. The whispers that had once been confined to pirate voxcasts were now a single deafening psychic roar that screamed directly into the mind of every man, woman, and child in the hive, a wave of pure, undiluted insanity that promised both everything and nothing. The reaction was instantaneous and absolute. The cultists, their faces upturned to the terrible new sky, fell to their knees in rapturous worship. They laughed and cried, their voices joining the insane chorus. This was it. This was the true hour of ascension, the final glorious fulfillment of the great change. The Guard, the hardened veterans of Cadia, reacted with ingrained instinctual terror and hatred. They knew this sight. This was the face of the archenemy, Their war of purgation had just become a war of damnation. For the civilians, for Ilara in her hiding place, for Marius in his spire, this was the final mind-breaking horror. The universe was not just cruel and uncaring. It was actively, malevolently insane. The very laws of reality were a lie. In the heart of the great swirling rift in the heavens, a shape began to form, a vast cosmic eye, whose iris was a vortex of madness, and whose gaze was a promise of a new and far more terrible hell. The great kaleidoscopic eye in the sky did not just watch, it wept. From the swirling, impossible heart of the warp rift, a rain of pure, raw chaos began to fall. It was not a physical substance, but a shower of scintillating, multicolored motes of light that drifted down upon the burning hive. Where they touched, reality buckled and broke. A plasteel barricade struck by the arcane dust writhed and transformed its hard gray surface, becoming a wall of screaming, fleshy faces. A street turned into a river of bubbling liquid light that flowed uphill. The very laws of physics, the last predictable constant in a world of madness, were being systematically unwritten. And from the bleeding wound in the heavens, the first of the rift's children began to pour forth. They were the demons of Tzeentch, the living embodiments of change and madness. The first wave was a tide of giggling, cackling horrors, beings of pure, solidified magic. Pink horrors. Their bodies rubbery and their limbs flailing, bounded across the rooftops, their joyful, insane laughter a sound that shattered the mind. They were followed by the smaller, perpetually grumpy and malevolent blue horrors, and the tiny, furiously burning brimstone horrors. They did not march like an army. They flowed like a river of insanity, a plague of chaotic energy that washed over the war-torn city. They were not here to conquer. They were here to play. The cultists who had been on their knees in rapturous worship were the first to receive their reward. They rose to greet their new gods, their arms outstretched. The horrors swarmed them not with the clean, killing fury of a predator, but with the cruel, playful curiosity of a child. Their touch was transformative. A cultist touched by a pink horror laughed as his skin turned to shimmering crystal, right before he shattered into a million pieces. Another screamed in agony as his arms writhed and melted, reforming into a pair of useless, flapping wings. Their promised ascension was a horrifying, agonizing metamorphosis into shrieking, mindless playthings for the very entities they had worshipped. Their new world had dawned, and it was a hell of their own making. The Cadian Guard, faced with this new, impossible foe, responded as they had been trained, with absolute, unwavering discipline. Line formation, volley fire for the Emperor. Their officers roared their voices, a point of defiant sanity in the madness. The disciplined ranks of the Guard unleashed a storm of lasfire into the demonic tide. Their aim was perfect. The beams struck the pink horrors, and the demons exploded in puffs of multicolored smoke and joyful shrieks. But from each destroyed pink horror, two smaller, angrier blue horrors would split and reform, doubling the number of enemies. The Guard's perfect logical tactics were useless against an enemy that multiplied when it was killed. Reality itself was now their enemy. A squad of guardsmen found the corridor they were defending twisting into an impossible repeating loop, forcing them to fight the same demons over and over. Another squad watched in horror as their laser guns melted in their hands, reforming into chittering serpentine creatures. For the few remaining civilians like Ilara and her group, this was the final, absolute apocalypse. There was no hiding from an enemy that did not obey the laws of space and time. The walls of their substation hiding place began to weep tears of molten light. The air grew thick with the sound of insane, cackling laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The war between the cult and the Imperium was over, its participants now just different kinds of prey for a new, far greater predator. As the tide of lesser demons spread chaos and madness, a great shadow fell from the warp rift above. A new, far more terrible shape descended. It was a lord of change, a greater demon of Tzeentch, a being of impossible size and alien intellect, its vast, feathered wings blocking out the chaotic light of the rift, its multifaceted jewel-like eyes seeing not a battle, but a grand, ever-changing game board that it had just set for itself. The true masters of the madness had arrived. Faced with an enemy that defied the laws of reality, the command structure of the Cadian 88th did not break. It hardened. The logic of Lord Castellan Dvorak and his commissariat was as brutal as it was simple. The hive was no longer a war zone to be reclaimed. It was a festering wound in the side of the Imperium, a source of demonic corruption that threatened to spread to the entire sector. The civilian population was no longer a populace to be saved. They were a liability, a billion potential hosts for the chaotic taint. A new, chilling order was broadcast from the command ship in orbit, a decree that sealed the fate of every soul on Vesperia. Protocol Extremis is now in effect. Dvorak's voice, cold and devoid of any emotion, announced on all loyalist channels. All non-regimental personnel on the surface are to be considered compromised. The civilian population of Hive Primus is declared hostis sordes. All sectors are now free fire zones. Purge all contacts, no quarter, no mercy. The Emperor protects through righteous annihilation. The effect on the ground was immediate. The Cadian Guard, already a brutal and efficient force, was now unleashed. They were no longer soldiers fighting an insurgency. They were exterminators cleansing a plague pit. Their tactical objective shifted from seizing territory to establishing overlapping fields of fire. Heavy bolter teams set up on high gantries, their weapons spitting a relentless stream of explosive shells at anything that moved in the streets below. Be it a cackling demon, a fanatical cultist, or a screaming family of refugees, the Guard had become a third and perhaps the most terrifying of the apocalyptic forces devouring the Hive. They were the cold, uncaring, and brutally logical response to the hot, passionate, and insane chaos of the warp. Kale and his small, battered squad of enforcers were trapped in this new hell. They had established a fortified position in a ruined transit station, their knowledge of the mid-hive's layout giving them a slight advantage. They were in the middle of a desperate firefight against a group of pink horrors, their power mauls proving surprisingly effective at disrupting the demon's unstable physical forms. Through the smoke and the flashes of arcane energy, Kale saw a squad of Cadians advancing down a parallel corridor. Relief, for a fleeting moment, surged through him. Allies. He opened a channel on his Vox. This is Sergeant Kale, Vesperian Palatine Guard to Cadian forces. We are loyalists, I repeat. We are loyalists holding Sector Delta 7. We need to coordinate fire. A Cadian officer, a young lieutenant with a grim face, responded. Hold your position, Palatine. We are advancing on your flank. But another figure stepped forward beside the lieutenant. It was a commissar, his black greatcoat swirling around him, his face a mask of stern, absolute authority. He raised a pair of magnoculars, his gaze falling upon Kale and his men, their armor battered and filthy, their bodies spattered with the ichor of demons and the blood of their own. The commissar lowered the magnoculars, his expression one of cold certainty. Negative, Lieutenant. The commissar's voice was sharp-cutting. The directive is clear. All local forces are compromised. They have been exposed to the taint for weeks. They are a vector for corruption. The lieutenant hesitated. Sir, they are fighting the demons. They claim loyalty. The commissar did not even glance at him. He drew his bolt pistol with a smooth, practiced motion. Their claims are irrelevant. Their potential for corruption is absolute. The purest faith can be broken by the horrors they have witnessed. We will not risk it. He leveled the pistol not at the demons, but at Kyle. Kyle saw the movement. His own superhuman reflexes screamed at him, but his mind froze in a state of pure cognitive dissonance. He was a loyal servant of the Imperium. This could not be happening. The commissar fired. The bolt shell crossed the 100 yards in an instant, striking Kale in the center of his chest. The explosive round detonated with a brutal crack, blowing a hole the size of a fist through his carapace armor and the two hearts that beat beneath it. Kale was thrown backwards, his power maul clattering to the ground. As he lay dying, his vision fading, his last sight was of the commissar's pitiless, unwavering face. In that final, terrible moment, he understood the ultimate brutal logic of the Imperium he had served. It was a great, uncaring machine, and to protect itself, it would grind its own loyal, functioning parts to dust at the mere suspicion of a flaw. He had killed his own humanity to uphold the law, and now the law was executing him for the crime of having survived. He did not die fighting the heretic or the demon. He died by the hand of the very savior he had been waiting for. In the highest shattered spire of Hive, Primus Lord Marius Amanti, the last of his line, was cornered. His family was dead, his servants had betrayed him, and his world of gilded luxury was a burning ruin. He was huddled in the ruins of his own throne room, armed with the ceremonial power sword he barely knew how to wield, as the sounds of inhuman, cackling laughter echoed from the corridors outside. A shimmer of impossible blue and pink light coalesced in the center of the room, and from it stepped a towering bird-like figure, a lord of change. "You were a lord," the greater demon whispered, its voice a symphony of 1,000 mocking truths. "You commanded this world. Now you command nothing but dust. I can give you that power back. Just for a moment. The power to have your revenge on all those who have wronged you. All you must do is ask." Marius, his mind broken by hunger and despair, his soul filled with a nihilistic rage, looked at the demon. He had nothing left to lose. "I accept," he snarled. A torrent of raw warp energy flooded his body. It was an agony and an ecstasy beyond any mortal comprehension. His body writhed and twisted, his eyes burning with blue fire as the power of Tzeentch remade him. For a single glorious and terrible moment, he was a god. He unleashed a wave of pure psychic fire from his outstretched hands, a storm of pink and blue lightning that tore through his penthouse. The wave of energy consumed his treacherous guards, their bodies dissolving into screaming crystalline statues. It blew out the walls of his spire, sending a rain of fire down upon the burning city below. It was a final, petulant act of vengeance from a man who had lost everything. And then, as quickly as it had come, the power vanished. The demon had claimed its price. Marius's body, his very soul, was consumed from within, dissolving into a shower of multicolored dust and a single, fading, insane laugh. Far below, Ilara's desperate journey had reached its final, hopeful destination. For days, she and her small group had navigated the living hell that their world had become, dodging the mindless hunger of the demons and the cold, logical fury of the Imperial Guard. Their goal was the last remaining Imperial stronghold, the Argus Prime spaceport on the Hive's edge, the designated evacuation point for the Cadian 88th. They finally reached it, a vast fortified plaza, lit by the harsh floodlights of the Guard, where massive troop landers were taking off their engines, a roar of defiance against the screaming sky. A desperate, surging crowd of thousands of other untainted civilians was pressed against the Cadian barricades, begging for a place on the departing ships. Ilara, carrying her exhausted sister while her brother and Corvin helped clear a path, pushed her way to the front. She stood before a stern-faced Cadian officer and a commissar, their faces grim and unyielding. "Please," Ilara begged, her voice raw. "We are civilians. We are not tainted. My siblings. They are just children. Please let us on." The commissar looked down at them, his gaze as cold and as empty as the void. He saw not a desperate family, but a potential vector of contamination, a statistical risk. The transports are for Imperial Guard personnel and vital assets. Only, he stated, his voice a flat, bureaucratic finality. "The Emperor will judge your souls in the fire of battle. Now fall back before we are forced to purge you ourselves." Behind him, the great ramp of the last transport began to rise with a hydraulic hiss. Ilara stared in disbelief, her last desperate hope turning to ash in her mouth. She and her small family, who had survived the horrors of the cult and the madness of the demons, were being abandoned. Before them stood the merciless firing line of their supposed saviors. Behind them, the gibbering, chaotic tide of the warp was closing in. There was no escape. High in the silent, cold void above Vesperia, aboard the bridge of the inquisitorial black ship, Divine Judgment, Lord Inquisitor Varus of the Ordo Malleus, watched the planet die. On the grand hololithic display before him, the world was not a place of a billion screaming souls, but a simple tactical map. A swirling, angry purple icon represented the ever-growing warp rift. Red icons representing demonic incursions were spreading across the planetary grid like a bloodstain. And the small, defiant green icons of the Cadian 88th were blinking out one by one as they were either overrun by demons or psychically corrupted by the raw, chaotic energy that now saturated the very air of the hive. Varus, a man who had witnessed the end of 100 worlds, watched with the cold, detached eye of a surgeon examining a terminal cancer. He had been in conference with Lord Castellan Dvorak for the last hour. Their options were laid out with brutal clarity. To continue the ground war would require at least a dozen more regiments of the Imperial Guard, a full Titan Legion, and likely a century of brutal, grinding warfare. The cost in manpower and material would be astronomical, and even then, victory was not guaranteed. The risk of the demonic taint, the psychic plague spreading from this single festering world to the surrounding systems, was calculated as being unacceptably high. The cold, ruthless mathematics of galactic survival pointed to only one logical, inescapable conclusion. Vesperia could not be saved. It had to be erased. Lord Inquisitor Varus turned to his ship's captain. There was no ceremony, no dramatic pronouncement. His voice was quiet, weary, the voice of a man who carried the weight of a billion souls on his conscience. The planet is lost. He stated, his voice a flat finality. The souls upon it are forfeit. We will not allow this cancer to spread beyond this system. He looked at the dying world on the hololith. A world of stories, of lives of suffering, all of which were about to be rendered into a single sterile data point. Authorized cyclonic protocol. The Emperor protects. On the bridge, a klaxon began to sound, a low, mournful tone that was the death knell of a world. In the ship's torpedo bay, a single colossal two-stage cyclonic torpedo was loaded into its launch tube. With a silent, smooth surge of magnetic energy, the torpedo was fired. It was a silver streak of judgment in the blackness of space, a silent messenger of absolute annihilation on its journey towards the doomed planet. On the surface of Vesperia, in the final fleeting moments of its existence, all the struggles, all the ideologies, all the hatred and the hope were rendered meaningless. In a forgotten alleyway, Ilara held her weeping siblings, her fight for survival over, as she watched the sky above the warp rift begin to burn with a new, impossibly bright white light. In the ruins of his precinct, the body of Enforcer Kale lay where it had fallen, a testament to a brutal, uncaring system, as the very ground beneath him began to glow. And in the heart of the demonic incursion, the greater demon of Tzinch, the Lord of Change, looked up from its grand game, its ancient, all-knowing eyes widening in a moment of genuine surprise, as a force even more final and more absolute than its own chaos descended. The cyclonic torpedo struck. It did not explode on the surface. It burrowed its meters of adamantium plating, punching through the planet's crust and deep into its molten core. And then it detonated. The first stage ignited the planet's atmosphere, turning the entire sky into a single roaring ball of white-hot plasma that vaporized everything on the surface in a single silent instant. The second stage cracked the planet's core and Vesperia died. Its crust shattered and great continent-sized plates of rock were hurled into the void, its oceans boiling away into space, its molten heart exposed and then extinguished by the cold, unforgiving vacuum. Aboard the Divine Judgment, a tech priest made a final entry into the ship's log. The hololithic display now showed only a new, brightly burning star, where Vesperia had been a star that would soon cool into a dead, barren rock. The entry was simple, clinical, and final. Planet Vesperia. Classification lost. Status purged via exterminatus. Threat contained. To the Imperium of man. This was a victory. A difficult but necessary choice had been made, and the galaxy was safer for it. But for the billions of souls who had lived, fought, hoped, and died on Vesperia, their stories, their loves, their tragedies were all now nothing. The apocalypse had not come from the alien, the heretic, or the demon. It had come from their own saviors, delivered with the cold, brutal, and utterly final logic of a system that would burn a city to save a brick. Their entire existence and their agonizing end was now just a single sterile and triumphant word in a dusty archive: purged.